This is Sovereign Debt, a podcast on greening the global economy and debt sustainability. I'm your host, Jill Doshi. Hello, everyone. As you know, a couple of weeks ago, I was at the DebtCon 5 conference, which was, as always in previous years, amazing. It's such a treat to be with all of the people who are interested in sovereign debt from different angles and different disciplines. It's really a terrific conference. And today's guest is Ugo Panizza, who's one of the original organizers of DebtCon, and probably more notably, he is also the professor of economics and the Pictet Chair in finance and development at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And previously, Ugo was the chief of the Debt and Finance Analysis Unit at UNCTAD, and he also has worked at the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank, and at the American University of Beirut and University of Turin. So, Ugo, it's such an honor to have you here. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Jill, for the invitation. It's great being here.
Going back to our time at the DebtCon, we were sharing a panel on the topic of climate and debt. We were on the panel with Zsolt Darvas, who is just on the podcast, chaired by Jean Pisani-Ferry. But in preparation for that panel, you sent us an advanced copy of a paper that you've been working on with several others for the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And in it, you're covering quite a wide range of topics on the issue of climate and debt, some of which I'd like to kind of delve into with you. But first, I want to touch on something that really came up on that panel that I thought was interesting and wanted to share with our whole audience. And this is this concept that Jean kept highlighting about what he was terming climate debt, which is more of I would say almost a moral issue or kind of an issue of kind of global justice about the real emissions or the kind of real limit to carbon emissions that the planet can hold, and that the idea that rich and developed countries have kind of almost already used up the environment. Can you touch on that concept a little bit?
Okay. So the main thing to know is that what it matters for climate change is the total amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And once CO2 goes in the atmosphere, it stays there for thousands of years. So It doesn't really matter who emits this CO2. It doesn't really matter when this CO2 was emitted. The only thing that matters is how much of it there is there. And according to climate models, if we want to keep increasing climate within 1.5 degrees, we have a budget left of about 300 gigatons of carbon. So if you want to limit the increase in average temperature by this much, that's how much we can put in the atmosphere, 300 gigatons of carbons. Why we can only issue 300 gigatons of carbons? Because we put a lot of carbon in the past. So we put about, I always get confused with all this zero, but if I really read correctly, 1.6 trillion gigatons of carbon. So there is all this carbon which has been put there in the atmosphere.
Kind of over the whole industrial age.
Over all the world history, but basically almost nothing was emitted until about the past 200 years. And the concept of carbon debt has to do with the fact that most of this carbon which is there, more than half of it, has been put there by today's rich countries. So given that there isn't much space left, people say, well, there is a debt. So these countries put all this carbon in the atmosphere, which will limit the ability of the countries which are now poor to emit carbon. And since the rich country got rich by emitting all this carbon, so now how can the poor countries become rich without emitting this carbon? And so maybe there is this idea that maybe the rich countries, they owe something to the poor countries to compensate them for all these emissions over the past 100 years. So in a nutshell, so that's the concept of carbon debt.
Yeah, so the idea is that we have to kind of budget the remaining kind of carbon space for, to stay within the kind of planetary limits, so to speak.
Correct.
And that the rich countries need to slow down their emissions and get to net zero, while giving some space for the developing countries to continue to develop, right?
Correct. So for instance, if you think about the two largest emitters currently, so the largest emitter nowadays is China. So China emits about 1/3 of the total carbon that goes into the atmosphere. The second largest emitter is the United States. However, the United States has emitted much more carbon than China in the atmosphere. So the Chinese, if these were the only two countries in the world, the Chinese would tell to the Americans, it's true that we're putting more carbon in the atmosphere right now, but you put much more in.
But now it's our turn, sort of.
Exactly.
The idea. Exactly. And if you look at it on a per capita basis, it's even more kind of.
Of course, because rich countries emit per capita much more than poor countries, but also there is a huge difference. For instance, if you consider the United States and Germany, so these are two countries with comparable standard of living. So, I mean, maybe the US or the average American is slightly richer than the average German, but there isn't a huge difference. And yet the average American emits about twice as much as the average German.
So this is where we then kind of move into these climate actions that need to take place. So
exactly,
the richer countries, such as the United States, need to work on mitigation, which is reducing or preventing kind of future emissions, right? They need to change their ways, basically.
Correct.
What we're saying. Whereas other countries need to kind of prioritize other climate actions.
So we can think that there are three types of climate-related expenditure, which will need to be financed in one way or the other. One is exactly mitigation, that it means, so it's mitigation of climate change, which has to do with reducing emissions. And here, clearly, most of this needs to be done in the countries that emit a lot. So, I mean, so if you look on the scale of global emission, sub-Saharan Africa basically doesn't emit anything. So,
they would like to.
they would like to be rich, but they don't emit anything. So there is not much, you're not going to get much. Even if you were to cut the emission of sub-Saharan Africa to zero, nothing will change.
It doesn't change. That's
exactly.
A rounding error.
So mitigation has to go, it needs to be implemented in the large emitters, which are, what I said, in China, India. India doesn't emit much per capita, but it's a very large country, so it emits a lot in total. The United States and Western Europe, which, given their income per capita, Western Europe emits less than the US. So that you can think of the European Union and the US having a similar economic size. Western Europe emits less than the US, but it still emits a lot. So that's where we need to focus. So that's a mitigation. So what it needs to be done to prevent a big increase in average temperature. The second type of expenditure has to do with adaptation. So, even if we were to cut emission to zero by tomorrow, the climate has already changed. So, I can see from my window, I can see the Mont Blanc, and, and the size of the glacier on the Mont Blanc kind of halved over the past 20 years. So this is there, and and for me, not seeing the Mont Blanc is not, it bothers me. I would like to see more snow, but it's not a big thing. But for certain countries, this has real economic consequences. So these countries will have to spend money to adapt to living in a warmer world, to adapt to having more extreme climate events.
Yeah, I like to think of the adaptation as kind of just the need for countries to kind of make sure that people aren't suffering more from it. So kind of putting in both plans or actually changing infrastructure, changing buildings or things so that, that the inevitable changes that we're going to experience and increased storms are met.
And most of this adaptation expenditure actually is in poor countries which do not emit a lot, but they're poor and they're subject to these extreme climate events. Some of them are small islands, so you want to think of the Maldives and so on and so forth. So that's the second type of expenditure that you need. And then the third type of expenditure that you need is a type of expenditure as an investment in technology that would allow countries to become rich, because we don't, Africa doesn't emit much because it's poor, but we don't want Africa to remain poor. We want it to become rich. And clearly it cannot become rich in the same way in which today's rich country became rich, or as China became relatively rich. So China increase its emission dramatically through its rapid growth progress. So this cannot be done. So we need to finance some technological innovations, some technological change, which would allow country to develop through a green route, not through the brown in the brown way in which today's rich country became rich. So that's the third type of expenditure.
And that's in the lingo of the climate world. This is what they call transitioning, right?
Correct. It's the transitioning, or we sometimes call it leapfrogging. So you want to leapfrog from low level of technology to a green technology without going through the brown process.
Exactly. But that's like the real trick, isn't it? Because,
correct.
We're basically having to say to these poorer countries, sorry, you don't get to develop in really what is the most effective and efficient and least expensive way, which is using hydrocarbons, right?
And well tested, right?
And well tested. And we know it works, and we know you can scale it, and we know how to do it. And then so the countries that are the most vulnerable to climate change for no fault of their own, and as you just were saying, they weren't the emitters before, and they're most exposed to the effects of climate change. And then on top of it, as they're trying to develop, we're saying, oh, sorry, you don't get to use these technologies that the rest of us used. You actually have to use the new innovations, which in some ways might be good in the sense of like you think of the telephones, they just completely skipped over landlines and went and developed very elaborate kind of mobile technologies and really have kind of set the pace even in mobile banking. So there are examples of this kind of leapfrogging working, but in the energy space, that's a little bit harder.
Yeah, correct. So everybody thinks about the case of the telephone. That was no brainer. But it's not so easy for everything. And in fact, for somebody like me who has been studying development economics for a long time, the traditional question is, how do you promote economic growth? It's a difficult question. So Robert Lucas, who's a famous economist, once wrote that when you start thinking about the question of economic growth, it's hard to think about anything else, because that's immense implication for human welfare. And it's a difficult question. But now we're going to make it even more difficult, because we want to make, this growth process
ultimate constraint on it, right?
Exactly, and while not emitting carbon, so it's an incredibly difficult.
But at the same time, and they are also, because they didn't develop and destroy their natural environments at the same rate that the richer countries have done, they are still now the stewards of some of the last and most critical ecosystems that the whole planet needs. At the same time, they have this wealth of natural capital that should be valued and should be they should be compensated in some way for continuing to protect, kind of to do nothing or to do the right thing.
There is a strong, first of all, moral case for transferring resources to these countries, exactly which are linked to this idea of carbon debt. And then there is also this issue that these countries still, have a massive wealth in terms of biodiversity, and which have a value for the planet, and it would be good to think how they can be, compensated in order to create incentives so that they can protect this biodiversity and that they have.
Yeah, and so these are the ideas of some of the emerging carbon markets and carbon credits, but also we know of research about actually pricing and kind of rewarding for what we call the kind of the services of these ecosystems. So whether it's the biodiversity or the actual other natural capital. I mean, that's kind of cutting edge of some of the stuff, and hopefully on other episodes we'll have some people come on that are working on that, because it's really interesting. But how to create an income stream to these countries for just protecting almost status quo. I mean, they can also be restoring forests and whatnot, but just really what we need is just don't cut it down for timber, or don't dig it up for, the minerals underneath. Right? We just need them to forego those opportunities, because we, the planet, need them to leave those ecosystems in place. We need to pay them for that. I mean, there needs to be some sort of market around that.
Correct. So you mentioned this report that we are working on. So this is a joint project with some of the people that you saw at DETCON. So Mito Gulati, that I think he was on your podcast recently, Lee Buchheit, Jerome Zettelmeyer, Patrick Bolton, and Beatrice Vedder Di Mauro. So we're doing together this report on debt and climate, and which hopefully will be out in September. And one of the strong messages that we want to push, we want to push that this carbon offset, this market for carbon offset needs to transition from a voluntary thing to a compulsory, and that once we have a well-regulated market and with compulsory offset, then this market would have a potential to be very large, and then countries that can actually sell this type of offset could indeed get an income stream related from protecting forest and etc. There is a big issue here which has to do with the initial allocation. So you need to find a way to initially allocate this offset, which is both fair, efficient, and politically feasible, which is it's not going to be easy.
No, it's not going to be easy. But I think if we continue just to keep pushing the system, and the more of us who, I think the more of us who are in the kind of sovereign debt world are pushing for these issues as well, and explaining it to the economists and to the IMF and to the powers that be, hopefully something starts to really happen on this front, and some changes can come in. Because, and this kind of leads me into my next issue that I wanted to kind of layer in here, is the issue of the debt sustainability. Because then when we're looking at these countries that are more vulnerable to climate change and who are also developing and have all of these needs for adaptation and this need for transitioning and leapfrogging and new technology. And so what we're describing is an enormous amount of investment, but many of these countries don't have market access. They are, as we know, kind of 60% of the low-income countries now are, either in or at risk of debt distress. They're grappling still with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now we have the war in Ukraine and higher energy prices. For many, that's a problem if they're importers of energy. We have increased food insecurity. Now we have, rising rates in that affect them, in their existing borrowing. So there's not a lot of space for these countries to pursue these investments. So I think another critical thing that we've certainly been working on, and I know also comes out in your paper, is how do we kind of make these linkages between sovereign debt sustainability and debt relief to climate and nature that is so critical?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there are many countries at high risk of debt distress. So you mentioned that about 2/3 of low-income countries are either already in that distress or classified by the IMF and the World Bank as being at high risk of that distress. And we might also get some larger emerging market countries that go into a debt crisis. And given all the shocks that you mentioned, now what we have been thinking, so there will be this debt crisis, and at the same time there will be need to protect investment for mitigation, adaptation, transition, which is going to be very costly. So our thinking along these lines is that so let's start thinking about countries which need to restructure their debt. Now, you have been part of many debt restructuring. It works. So there is a country which has problems servicing its debt. It needs to restructure the debt. So it means that either reducing the face value or reducing the payment profile, which will lead to some sort of debt reduction in NPV term, in net present value term. And how big is this debt reduction? It depends a little bit on the bargaining power of the various parties, but it's usually backed by a debt sustainability analysis, which is conducted by the IMF, which sort of gives some estimates of a country's ability to service its debt. And so we what we think that in the future, the macroeconomic assumption used at the basis of this debt sustainability analysis should explicitly include climate-related cost. So they need to invest in adaptation, the possible cost of extreme climate events. So I think that the way to do it is to directly include this climate cost into the DSA.
I totally agree, but then we have to realize it just actually makes the picture look worse for these countries.
Of course, but not acknowledging it doesn't make
I know, but I just want to kind of like highlight that this actually then leads to more countries being in distress potentially.
Correct, so more countries to be in distress.
And when we start to get real about the risks that they are actually facing, then and the costs of doing all of that, then it really does put it quite clearly that more needs to be done.
And deeper haircut when the country gets in that distress. Correct. Yeah, that's something that we need to recognize. One important thing that we think, and we write in the report that we're preparing, is that countries should receive a better treatment in terms of debt reduction in NPV terms, in order to protect this climate expenditure. But there should be some conditionality linked to this, that countries indeed use the resources, the freed up resources to spend the money for this climate-related expenditure. Because if they don't do this, even in a perfect world in which you forecast everything, if then I don't spend the money in these climate events, then I'll be in a debt crisis again very soon.
Right. You don't want to use the argument of climate change to give them a greater discount and then have them turn around and
exactly
invest in coal or diesel or something. No. And so that's where I think, and this is where what Potomac Group has been working on is looking at mechanisms for using sustainability-linked bonds and those sorts of options in a debt restructuring so that, again, as you know, you can have in a debt restructuring, when you have an exchange offer, you have option A, which is maybe a local currency bond. Option B has a longer maturity. Option C has a shorter maturity, but a bigger discount. And what we'd like is to see actually that there's always another option there, or maybe all of them have to have some sort of, sustainability linkages.
Correct. That's a great idea. And it's idea. So one thing that also we discuss, I keep mentioning this report, which is not in the public domain yet, but
I know it's not fair to our readers.
Yeah,
I've already done this once to them with Katya, and everyone was like, "Where's the paper? Where's the paper?" And we're like, "Oh,
but it will be out soon.
It's coming soon."
And if some of your listener really wants us to have a sneak preview, they can send me an email. So one issue that we think need to think very hard, and we discussed a little bit, is that how to make this condition enforceable. Because in the report we looked at many green bonds which are not sustainability linked bonds, because there are bonds which are based on use of proceeds.
And those are quite problematic.
And these are quite problematic because countries say, give us the money, we'll spend the money for green projects.
We just do whatever we want.
But there is no commitment to actually doing it.
Yeah, no, and that's why we've actually been working a lot with the World Bank and loads of other parties on just kind of really thinking through what are the best structures for a sovereign sustainability linked bonds, because we've seen them in the corporate sector, and we know Chile just did one. But it was very much like the corporate, it's a strong sovereign, so they could take that kind of corporate model. What we've been designing is kind of actually something for kind of weaker countries or in, a debt restructuring scenario. But going back to the DSA, I've heard that, the IMF is updating their DSAs and to incorporate this, particularly for the MAC countries. I think for the low-income countries, they're still kind of struggling with figuring out how to put more bells and whistles on that framework. Do you see them actually embracing this issue? And does this mean that, the IMF is really looking at climate and nature and biodiversity, the costs of all of the transition, as well as the risk of doing nothing? Like, what happens if we don't do this?
They are definitely, that's an incredibly difficult task, but they are definitely working on it. I know that climate and sustainability is definitely a big issue at the IMF now. So I think, in fact, to tell you the truth, when I talk with friends in your, around you in Washington, some people are not happy about this. Some people.
No, exactly. That's why I'm asking from your perspective.
Some people at the fund say, this is not our mission. There is inflation going up, and we're all which is our mandate, and and people are working on climate. Some people at the World Bank are not happy because they see the IMF like going in their turf. So there is some discontent associated to this, but my understanding that there is definitely the leadership of the fund is very much committed to this. So until there is the current leadership, I think they will be doing work on this.
Well, I've definitely been kind of conveying to them that this is central to their mandate, because this is the ultimate market disruptor, or if you want to talk about, instability of the system.
No, correct. I mean, this is gonna be a massive source of macro level shocks, and which is very much part of their bread and butter. Yes,
and increasingly unpredictable and increasingly risky all over the place, and with unknown consequences in terms of then migration and starvation and possibly even more conflicts over various resources. So I think it certainly can't be ignored, but it'll be interesting to see how it actually kind of comes out in the new DSA frameworks. And one other question is that then when we're talking about all of this kind of need for support of the poorer countries and the developing countries, one very big issue that needs to be addressed is the largest lender to these countries, which is in fact China. So China is grappling with its own adaptation, transition, mitigation efforts, and in its own development context. But at the same time, they're also the largest lender and investor in other developing countries. And not to put you on the spot, but do you see China kind of helping this effort to link sovereign debt relief? I mean, I'm heading towards a question about the common framework. And do we, from your perspective, do you see hope of kind of greening in some ways the common framework? Let's put it that way.
That's a good question. So I haven't seen anything in that direction. It seems to me a natural direction where we should go. Even though, again, remember that the common framework so far mostly it's only available for low income countries, which tend to be not to emit much. So if we think in terms of greening, in terms of mitigation, that I wouldn't see this as a first order priority, because these guys are not emitting much.
No, but in the sense of like the common framework, treating the debt stocks and taking into consideration their vulnerability and their need for adaptation and transition, then you actually.
Correct. So I think if at the end treatment under the common framework are again partly based on that sustainability analysis done by the IMF staff. So if the next step of the fund will be to include this climate consideration. Now most of the work is on market access countries, but if they're going to move to include this also for the low income country, which are the objects of the DSF, it will be in a sense automatically incorporated. And I see no reason why once these climate considerations are included in the market access country DSF, I don't see any reason why they should not be included in the low income country DSF. And so that in a sense would carry automatically to the common framework. And
I don't want to burden the common framework with too much more, in the sense that it's already kind of struggling to get going. But at the same time, I see it maybe, too optimistically, but I see it as maybe that this is a way out, or to help the common framework get going. Because these issues actually have generally greater political buy-in and are certainly easier to talk about, in the sense that you're talking about new investment and new kind of technologies and addressing those issues, whereas debt sustainability and just debt write-offs and discounts and haircuts and all can be grim. At least that's kind of what we've been experiencing.
Let me just add something about China. So that China they created their own debt sustainability framework, which is basically identical to the IMF World Bank debt sustainability framework, with just basically one difference, that while the World Bank IMF DSF, it's clear on the source of their macro assumptions, which are basically the World Economic Outlook assumptions. China, the Belt and Road Initiative, that's a sustainable framework, is less clear about this. And so if this macro assumption will be a key way to incorporate climate risk in that sustainability analysis, if the two framework, the World Bank, IMF, DSF, and the Belt and Road Initiative, DSF, differ in the macro assumptions, so they might differ on how climate risk will be incorporated in assessing that sustainability.
Is the idea that those need to converge?
I'm not saying this. This is actually something that I didn't think before. While you were talking about China, I just thought about this, that the two framework are identical with the exception of the source of the macro assumption. And if the macro assumption is where climate will be incorporated, they might differ along these lines.
Definitely something to look into. I'm making a note even as I speak to you. Yeah, that's very interesting, because I think that's, if we can somehow get China on board with some of this, I think then, and obviously, aside from the rich countries needing to, in particular the United States and Western Europe needing to continue on their own mitigation efforts, which I think is going to make the biggest impact. But, when we're looking at the vulnerable countries and how to help address the vulnerability to debt distress at the same time as trying to help address vulnerability to climate change, we're going to really need to work together with China, I think. I've taken up a lot of your time, but it is our kind of, I don't know if it's tradition, but certainly practice to ask our guests to have the last word. And usually I just leave it open-ended of what would you like to say to either debt managers who might be listening, who are facing all of these challenges right here, right now, as rates just went up in the US significantly and everything else that we're talking about, or to other policymakers. We know lots of folks at the bank and the fund and around the world are listening. So give you the floor for the last word.
Okay, so I'll say something that might sound self-serving, but I think it's not so much. So I think that policymaker, debt manager, they can get a lot of free advice, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but it's free, from people like me, and people like me too, who are a bit obsessed of doing research about that. And our biggest constraint in working on this and writing about this is access to data and access to good quality data. And so if I could ask something to policymakers and debt managers, is give us better data.
And that kind of goes, is that the same issue as the transparency issue, or is that different?
I think there are two issues there, and the World Bank had a nice report done by Diego Rivetti, with a great economist who works in the World Bank, that division. And it was on debt transparency, and there are two issues there. Part of lack of data is linked to lack of capacity in debt management offices, and so and there is, and I think money, the international financial institution should help, and they do it in partly, but they should do more helping debt management office in poor countries, because I think that's very important. But part of it is unwillingness to disclose this data, which I think it's simply wrong, because this is public debt and data on public debt should be public. I understand that there are some very, very rare exceptional cases that for national security you don't want to disclose something, but this should really be the exception. I think that, for 99% of the transaction, there is absolutely no reason why the data should not be public.
No, and we agree. And we actually talked with Anna Gelpern about some of this, particularly in the China context, but even more broadly, that countries actually can be proactive on this issue and even through legislation kind of insist that this is the way they're going to be doing business.
Correct. And I don't want to stigmatize China, because China is different.
I don't either.
Has a beautiful paper, but it's not just China. I mean, there is a niche of
no.
most wealthier China.
Far from it. From it. No, I know. We don't have to start on that whole issue, but yes, okay. I totally agree. And I hope I have, kind of made clear through all of my speaking on all of this, is that I don't want to be bashing on China. Quite the contrary. I want to find ways to work with them more effectively and help them lead, actually, as they are, as we said earlier, kind of the largest lender out there. So they should be leading on some of these issues. Thank you so much, Ugo. This has been a real pleasure to have you. And we look forward to this paper that we've been referring to. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jill.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a review and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts.